There comes a point in everyone's life where silence is no longer a survival tactic. It becomes a weapon, a shield, a throne. You don't even realize when it happens at first. You spend years swallowing your reactions, explaining yourself when you shouldn't have to, and bending until the spine of who you are starts to curve in on itself. But eventually something shifts. Something small but irreversible. A moment that catches you off guard. Maybe it's a passive comment someone makes. One of those little jabs disguised as jokes. The kind that laughs at your expense. Maybe it's an interruption mid-sentence again, like your voice doesn't hold the same weight as theirs. Or maybe it's just a look, one that implies your presence is optional. And suddenly the realization comes like a quiet revelation. You've had enough, not in a loud, dramatic way, not in the way people expect when they think of confrontation. This is a slow burn, a steady pulse of no more. And you don't yell, you don't cry, you just stop playing along. That's where the real power is. Not in the noise, in the refusal. It's in the moment you meet someone's disrespect, not with a clap back, not with desperate justification, but with stillness. With a stare so still, it makes them confront themselves. A stare that says, I see what you're doing, and I choose not to participate. You learn to master that look, not because you enjoy confrontation, but because you've realized that silence can be the loudest declaration of all. It can dismantle an entire ego without saying a word. There was a time when I didn't know that. When someone would interrupt me, I'd fumble my way back into the conversation, trying to keep the peace, trying to prove I deserve the floor. But peace isn't kept when it's built on your own dismissal. So one day when the interruptions came again, I did something different. I leaned back, crossed my arms, locked eyes, and I waited. No blinking, no smirk, no reply. Just the kind of calm that unnerves people. The silence stretched, and in that silence, something broke. Not in me, in them. You see, when people are used to dominating conversations, they thrive on your reaction. They want your discomfort. It gives them power. But when you deny them that power, not with anger, but with calm detachment, it unsettles them. It confuses them. It forces them to fill the void they created. And in doing so, they reveal everything about themselves. The neediness, the insecurity, the hollow bravado. That day, the person who always cut me off didn't know what to do. He stumbled, looked away, and suddenly the room had a new rhythm, one that included my voice. What I didn't expect was how that silence changed not just the dynamic, but me. I walked out of that room taller, not physically, internally, like something within had realigned. Because when you meet disrespect with composure, you stop fighting to be heard and start being heard by default. That's when people listen, not when you scream, but when you don't need to say anything at all. That silence, it's not passive, it's precise. It's years of learning that not everything deserves your energy, and not every provocation needs your explanation. And once you taste that, once you feel the power of calm refusal, you start seeing disrespect differently. It's no longer a fire to put out, it's a test, and you already know the answer. You start seeing the patterns, the jokes that aren't jokes, the invitations to arguments disguised as conversations, the subtle ways people poke at your boundaries just to see if you'll defend them. And instead of rising to the bait, you stare, you pause, you let your presence speak for you. It's strange at first how powerful that feels. To just not react, to let the discomfort hang like thick air around them while you remain still. It doesn't make you less human, it makes you deeply in tune with yourself. You're no longer proving your worth, you're assuming it, and that assumption, when it's real, radiates in ways louder than words ever could. I remember being in a room where I was the only one who didn't respond to a veiled insult. It was one of those moments where someone cloaks their disrespect in humor, waiting for a laugh to validate their cruelty. But I didn't laugh. I didn't look embarrassed. I didn't offer a fake smile. I just looked at them, steady. The joke died before it reached the end of their sentence. Because the thing about silence is, it becomes a mirror. It reflects back to people what they often spend their lives trying to hide. And most of them can't handle the view. But that reflection, it's not for them. It's for you. Because every time you choose silence over reaction, you're practicing something deeper than defense. You're preserving your peace. You're choosing dignity over drama. You're saying to the world, I know who I am and you can't touch that. It took me years to get there, to learn that silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. To understand that not every insult deserves my breath, that my time, my energy, my attention, these are currencies, and I get to choose how I spend them. Not everyone earns a response. Not every confrontation is worth your clarity, and that is a lesson worth learning slowly, deeply over time. I used to be the person who explained everything. Why I made a choice, why I missed a call, why I didn't show up, as if living my life was some kind of public debate. But you learn, sometimes painfully, that people who ask why aren't always asking because they care. They're asking because they want you to doubt. They want to poke holes in your confidence and stitch them back up with their expectations. That's when you realize that your decisions don't need to be digestible to others to be valid. They just need to feel right to you. So you stop explaining. You stop handing out pieces of your peace like flyers to people who never plan to stay. You answer questions with, because I wanted to, or not at all. And the power in that is staggering. It's not about arrogance, it's about ownership. You begin to live without permission. You start choosing without justification. And that, more than anything, begins to separate you from those who live in the shadows of other people's approval. Not everyone will understand. That's okay. You're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to be real with yourself. You're here to take up space without apology, to walk into rooms without shrinking, to set standards that speak before you do. And when people cross them, you don't scream, you don't plead, you simply stand firm. Maybe you look them in the eye, maybe you walk away. But what you don't do, what you never do, is let them drag you down into the pit of their own confusion. The more you practice this, the more you realize how freeing it is to stop explaining, to stop defending, to stop hoping someone sees your worth when you already know it. You don't owe anyone the math of your decisions. You don't need to break down your boundaries into bite-sized pieces for others to chew on. If they can't respect the no, they never deserve the yes. And here's the truth no one tells you. The people who push back the hardest when you hold your ground, they're the ones who benefited most from your lack of boundaries. They're the ones who fed on your self-doubt, your need to please, your fear of being misunderstood. So when you change, when you go quiet, when you stop explaining and start being, they feel it. Not because you're hurting them, but because you're finally refusing to hurt yourself for their comfort. That silence, that stare, that unapologetic decision to stop justifying your existence, it's not just a reaction, it's a revolution. One quiet moment at a time. You start noticing how people shift when they can no longer manipulate you with guilt. There's a look they get, not anger, not confusion exactly, but something like discomfort wrapped in curiosity. Because they're used to people folding, used to getting their way just by adding the right amount of pressure, saying the right mix of half-concerned, half-critical words. But when you stand your ground, when your silence doesn't come from fear but from resolve, they don't know what to do with it. And that's when you realize most of the conflict in your life wasn't about you. It was about your refusal to play a role you never auditioned for in the first place. I remember a moment when I stopped mid-conversation, realizing how many times I had bent myself into shapes to make someone else more comfortable. Shrinking opinions, laughing at things I didn't find funny, nodding just to keep the peace. It was so ingrained that I didn't notice it was happening until it wasn't anymore. And the silence that followed, it wasn't awkward. It was holy, like my spirit was finally taking up space in my own body again. There's a kind of authority that comes when you learn to live unapologetically, not the kind that shouts, the kind that's so sure it doesn't need to be loud. It moves through a room without disrupting it, but changes everything once it's passed. You begin to notice how few people actually want to know you. They want to shape you. They want the parts of you that are easy to love, easy to manage. But when you show them your depth, your truth, your firm no, they either rise to meet it or slowly back away. Either way, the clarity is worth the price, because once you begin living from that place where your silence is sacred and your boundaries are woven into your every breath, you stop fearing loss. You stop fearing the friend who drifts away when you say you're unavailable. You stop fearing the partner who pulls back when you stop performing emotional labor. You stop fearing the colleague who labels you difficult when you stop doing work outside your role. You realize these weren't real connections. They were contracts of convenience, and you never signed them consciously. So you tear them up piece by piece and finally breathe in your own name again. And breathing becomes different. It's not just survival anymore. It becomes presence. You feel yourself settling into your own skin, finally belonging to yourself. You don't need to monitor the room for cues, adjusting your tone or posture to avoid discomfort. You just are. And that is a radical act in a world that profits off your self-abandonment. People will tell you you've changed. Some will say it like an accusation, others like a warning. But you'll learn to hear it as confirmation, because you have changed. You've shed layers of yourself that were never yours to begin with. Expectations, roles, responsibilities you never asked for, but carried anyway. You'll look back and realize how heavy it all was, and how light you feel now, even in solitude. That solitude, that's the part no one prepares you for. When you first start setting boundaries and choosing yourself, there's a quiet period, a kind of echo. You lose people, or maybe they lose access to you, and that feels like losing you. So they retreat or retaliate, and you're left in a space that feels both terrifying and liberating. But in that space, you find yourself. You hear your own thoughts without interruption. You learn what your voice sounds like when it's not trying to please, and that voice becomes your guide. You start talking to yourself differently, not the inner critic who echoes everything you feared others believed, but a gentler voice, one that asks, "What do you need?" and waits for the answer. You stop pushing yourself past exhaustion just to keep up. You stop filling every silence with noise. You start enjoying your own company. And it's not always easy, but it's real. And in a world obsessed with surface-level connection, real becomes your new standard. Your standards change too. Not because you become rigid or self-righteous, but because you know what it took to become this version of yourself. You know the nights you cried yourself to sleep, wondering if you'd ever feel safe in your own mind again. You know the courage it took to walk away from people you loved because they couldn't love you without conditions. You know the healing wasn't linear, that it came in waves, that sometimes you backslid into patterns just to remember why you outgrew them. So now when someone comes along trying to sell you the same version of love that once broke you, you smile, you nod, but you don't buy in. Not because you're bitter, but because you're free. And freedom feels different when it's earned. It's not about doing whatever you want without consequence. It's about knowing your why so deeply that no one else can shake it. It's about understanding that alignment sometimes looks like loss in the beginning, that choosing peace over people isn't always celebrated, that some days you'll miss the comfort of your old cage, Because the open air can feel overwhelming when you're used to confinement, but you'll remember. You'll remember how you felt every time you ignored your own needs, every time you betrayed yourself just to belong. And that memory will anchor you in truth. It will remind you that the discomfort of growth is nothing compared to the agony of staying small. You start walking differently, not with arrogance, with assurance. You don't rush, you don't chase, you don't beg. You become rooted, grounded in your worth. You don't seek validation. You recognize it in your reflection. And when someone treats you as less, you don't argue. You just leave, because you don't negotiate with anyone about your right to exist fully. People will say you're intimidating, that you're too much, that you've changed, and they'll be right. You've become a mirror, and mirrors don't lie, they reflect. They show people what they've been avoiding, and not everyone is ready for that. You stop shrinking to fit the spaces you've outgrown. You stop explaining your intuition. You stop second-guessing your no. You know now that your boundaries are not walls, they're doors, and only the people who knock with respect get invited in. You stop over-apologizing, not because you're never wrong, but because you no longer feel responsible for other people's comfort when you're telling your truth. You apologize when you harm, not when you exist, and that distinction changes everything. You become softer, strangely, not harder, because strength isn't cold, it's warm. It's the kind of warmth that says, I've been through fire and I don't burn others to prove it. You become the kind of person who listens deeply, not because you want to be liked, but because you see people. You hear them, but you no longer lose yourself trying to understand others. You carry your center with you now, wherever you go. It's funny how things fall away once you no longer chase. People, roles, opportunities that once felt urgent. They either align or they don't. And when they don't, you don't force it. You don't beg the door to open. You walk away with love, with gratitude. But you walk. You start attracting different kinds of relationships. Ones built on reciprocity, not rescue. On truth, not tolerance. You find yourself surrounded by people who don't require performance, who don't flinch at your depth, who meet your vulnerability with their own. And you realize this. This is what connection was always meant to feel like. Not a transaction, not a test, but a sanctuary. And you become a sanctuary too. Not for everyone, but for those who value truth, who seek depth, who recognize the sacred in your presence. You live slower, speak less, but mean more. You laugh easier, cry without shame, and when someone tries to pull you back into the version of you they remember, the version you worked so hard to evolve from, you smile. And you let them talk, but you don't step back. Because you've learned, you've earned, you've become, and now you belong to yourself. Fully, finally. Sometimes the most powerful transformation is the one that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with fireworks or milestones or grand declarations. It happens quietly, on the floor of your apartment at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling with tear-streaked cheeks, wondering how much more of yourself you have to lose before you finally feel whole. It comes in the middle of conversations when you notice how you no longer agree just to avoid conflict. It blooms when you realize that the person you're becoming doesn't need everyone's approval to breathe. It's not a clean break. It's a slow, uneven molting, painful, raw, disorienting, but necessary. You start seeing yourself in fragments at first, like shards of glass catching pieces of light. The you who stayed silent when you wanted to scream. The you who kept giving even when you were empty. The you who laughed too loudly to cover the sound of your own breaking. And instead of judging those versions, you begin to gather them, not to stitch them back together into who you used to be, but to bury them properly. To say, thank you for surviving, and then let them rest. Because survival isn't living, and you're not here just to survive anymore. The world still expects you to perform. It still hands you scripts written by people who never knew your name, but felt entitled to your time. Smile. Say yes. Don't make it awkward. Be grateful for what you're given. And for a while, maybe even years, you followed those lines like gospel. You believed that being liked was more important than being known. That keeping peace meant keeping quiet. That healing was something you did in private, so no one had to feel uncomfortable around your pain. But something shifted. Something always does. Maybe it was a heartbreak, a betrayal, a slow unraveling of the mask you wore so well. And when it fell, you didn't reach to put it back on. You looked at it, studied it, then set it on fire. That fire didn't just burn away the old you, it illuminated the path to the new one. A path paved with hard truths and soft mornings, with lonely nights and liberating clarity. You started walking it not because you had all the answers, but because you were tired of pretending you didn't have questions. Real ones, like, what if I deserve more? And what if I'm not the problem? And what if walking away isn't quitting, but reclaiming? Questions that rattled everything you thought was solid, but in that shaking, you found something real. Yourself. The people around you began to notice. They might not have said it, but they felt it. The way you no longer rushed to explain. The way your no longer came with a list of apologies. The way you didn't flinch when silence filled the space between you and them. Some admired it, others feared it. Because when you stop shrinking, you force others to look at the ways they've been living small. And not everyone's ready for that. You stopped accepting crumbs disguised as connection. You stopped romanticizing potential. You stopped setting yourself on fire just to keep others warm. And when you did, the loneliness came. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right. Because the versions of you that people had loved weren't real. They were reflections of their comfort, not your truth. And now that you were living in your truth, some disappeared. Let them. Not everyone is meant to walk with you through the sacred parts of becoming. And in that sacred space, you found something else. Something rare. You found your voice. Not the one that echoes what others want to hear. The one that trembles but tells the truth. The one that says, I am not who I was. I don't owe you who I used to be. And I don't need you to understand me to know that I'm worthy. That voice is a compass. It won't always be loud. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's a scream. But it's always there, waiting for you to trust it more than you trust the noise of the world. You began to trust it, and in doing so, you learned the art of choosing yourself. Not once, not loudly, but daily, quietly, in the way you protect your peace like it's sacred, in the way you honor your boundaries without theatrics, in the way you forgive yourself for the years you spent lost, and offer grace for the days you still feel unsure. Because healing isn't linear. Growth isn't glamorous. It's messy, it's tender. It's filled with moments of wanting to go back. Not because the past was better, but because it was familiar. But you don't go back. You sit with the discomfort. You stay. And in that staying, something begins to shift. You start recognizing the difference between solitude and loneliness, between silence and suppression, between stillness and stagnation. You stop filling every moment with noise. You let the quiet teach you. Let the emptiness hold you. Let the slowness become a rhythm instead of a punishment. And slowly your life begins to feel like it fits. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer pretending. That's when you begin to attract the real ones. The people who meet you at your depth, not just your surface. The ones who don't need you to be small to feel big. Who don't flinch when you're honest. Who listen without fixing. Who stay without demanding. These connections aren't loud. They're steady. They feel like peace, like truth, like home. And the beauty is you stop clinging to them because you no longer believe love is something to be earned or kept through performance. You know now that the people meant for you will not require you to betray yourself. And if they leave, it's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their readiness. You stop trying to be the version of yourself that made everyone else comfortable. You stop shape-shifting to fit rooms that were never built with you in mind. You walk in as you are, and you let the room adjust or not. Either way, you remain. There's a quiet confidence that comes with that, one that doesn't need to be proved. It's in the way you smile without needing approval, the way you say no without guilt, the way you choose yourself in small, consistent ways. Like going to bed early instead of answering one more text. Like leaving a conversation that drains you. Like eating alone without shame. These choices may seem small, but they build a life that honors you. And when the doubt comes, and it will, you'll know how to meet it. Not with panic, but with presence. You'll say, I see you, but I don't need you to lead. Because fear doesn't disappear. It just loses its grip when you stop feeding it. You'll have moments where the old you tries to come back, where people try to pull you into roles you've outgrown, where life tests you with familiar patterns, but you'll recognize them. And instead of reacting, you'll pause, you'll breathe, and you'll choose again. That choice, it's your power. Because the truth is, becoming yourself isn't a one-time event. It's a daily decision to show up, to speak up, to stay soft, to stay sovereign. And on the days you forget, you'll remember that forgetting is part of the process, that grace is a practice, that healing doesn't demand perfection, it invites presence. So you keep going, not to arrive, but to return again and again, to the self you buried, to the voice you silenced, to the life you paused, until you no longer need to remember how it feels to be you. Because being you is now your default setting. There comes a moment, one you can't anticipate, one no calendar marks, when you realize you've outgrown your old pain. Not because it doesn't hurt anymore, not because the memories have faded or the scars have disappeared, but because it no longer defines you. You carry it still, in the way a tree carries rings within its trunk, evidence of storms weathered, years survived, but you no longer wear it as your whole identity. You stop introducing yourself through the lens of your damage. You stop needing people to understand your suffering in order to see your worth. And in that shift, something quiet but monumental occurs. You start living forward. You start walking into rooms without scanning for threats. You begin talking without rehearsing your every word. You stop preparing for disappointment before you've even been offered anything real. It's not that you become naive. It's that you finally start believing the world isn't always out to hurt you. That maybe, just maybe, there's space for joy too. That your heart, as tender as it is, was built for more than survival. It was built to feel fully, fiercely, without asking for permission. You start to notice things differently. The way light filters through the blinds at sunrise, the sound of laughter in another room, the way someone holds a cup of tea with both hands like it's sacred. These details, once lost in the blur of your own pain, begin to return. Not because life has suddenly become easier, not because everything is perfect, but because you finally understand that you don't need perfection to be at peace. The world will still challenge you. People will still disappoint you, but you're different now. You know how to choose yourself without collapsing. You know how to set a boundary without losing sleep over who it might offend. You know how to walk away with love still in your heart. You've learned that leaving doesn't have to be angry. It can be quiet, clear, necessary. It can sound like, I care about you, but I care about me too. And that is not selfish. It's sacred. You begin to recognize your own patterns with a kind of compassionate clarity. You see where you used to give away too much, too fast. You see how you used to mistake chaos for passion, instability for depth. You stop chasing people who need fixing. You stop romanticizing the potential of someone who doesn't even meet you halfway. And for the first time, you don't feel guilty about it. You don't feel cold or closed off. You feel calm, rooted, steady, like you finally know what love is supposed to feel like. Not a roller coaster, but a river, deep, flowing, constant. The love you seek no longer has to be loud or dramatic to feel real. It doesn't need to come wrapped in fireworks or crisis. You stop craving the intensity that leaves you hollow. You start seeking the kind of presence that feels like coming home. You want softness now, consistency, safety, not the illusion of it, but the embodied truth of it, the kind that doesn't punish you for your needs or weaponize your vulnerabilities. And because you know that now, you no longer settle for less. You don't try to convince anyone to choose you. You choose yourself every day. And that choice rewires everything. You wake up and greet yourself with tenderness, no longer rushing to correct or fix, just noticing, being. You stop criticizing yourself for still having moments of grief or fear. You stop measuring your healing by how productive you are or how happy you seem. You start honoring the quiet victories, the days you got out of bed, the times you said no when it would have been easier to say yes, the moments you felt sadness and didn't shame yourself for it. Those small acts, they're massive. They're miracles. The relationship you have with yourself begins to deepen. You learn how to self-soothe, not by numbing or escaping, but by staying, by placing a hand on your heart and saying, "I'm here, I've got you." You become your own anchor, your own sanctuary, your own soft place to land. And the more you trust yourself, the less you look for validation in places that never gave it freely. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-apologizing. You stop shrinking in rooms just to make others feel bigger. You understand that you can be kind and still have edges, that you can be warm and still say no, that you can love someone and still let them go. You stop playing the role of emotional contortionist. You take up space without guilt, and the world doesn't end. It expands. You stop waiting for closure from people who were never capable of giving it. You give it to yourself. You write the letter you'll never send. You cry the tears you've been holding back for years. You look in the mirror and forgive yourself for not knowing better, for staying too long, for leaving too soon, for trying so hard, for breaking, for healing, for surviving the only way you knew how. And that forgiveness, it's not just healing, it's holy. You no longer chase people who run. You no longer beg for attention. You no longer prove your worth through sacrifice. When someone pulls away, you let them, not with bitterness, but with grace. Because now you understand that what's meant for you will never require you to abandon yourself. And what isn't meant for you is a blessing in disguise, space clearing for something truer. You become grateful for the lessons, even the brutal ones, especially the brutal ones, because they showed you what you needed to see. They carved out room inside you for new truths to grow. They stripped away the illusions. They taught you discernment. And now you move differently, not with armor, but with awareness. You don't fear falling anymore. You've fallen before and still got up. What you fear now is betraying yourself, and that fear keeps you honest, keeps you aligned. You find joy in the simplest things, a song you used to love, a meal cooked just for you, the sun warming your face, the sound of your own laughter. These small moments stitch your spirit back together. You stop waiting for big moments to feel alive. You find life in the details, in the now, in the breath, in the heartbeat that reminds you you're still here, still growing, still worthy. And on the days it's hard, because there will be those days, you don't spiral. You pause, you soften, you reach for tools instead of toxins. You journal, you stretch, you rest. You call someone who reminds you who you are. Or you sit with yourself until you remember. You stop abandoning yourself at the first sign of discomfort. You ride the wave. You hold your own hand. You make it through. Eventually, you look back and barely recognize the person you used to be. Not with shame, but with compassion. They were doing their best. You thank them. You honor them. But you no longer carry their pain as your own. You've transformed it, alchemized it, turned it into wisdom, into strength, into softness. You speak differently now, with intention, with clarity, with courage. You no longer perform humility by downplaying your brilliance. You no longer weaponize your story to gain sympathy. You own your experience without apology, and your voice becomes an instrument of truth, of light, of love, not just for others, but for you. You no longer ask, "Am I too much?" You ask, "Is this space too small?" And when the answer is yes, you don't shrink. You expand, you rise, you move on. You begin to dream again, not just of surviving, but of thriving. You imagine lives bigger than the one you were told to settle for. You envision relationships built on truth, work that nourishes your soul, communities where you feel seen, and those dreams stop feeling foolish. They feel possible. They feel inevitable. Because now you believe, not just in the world, but in yourself. Healing doesn't ask for your perfection. It asks for your participation. It doesn't demand you get everything right the first time or pretend to be whole when you're still in pieces. It simply invites you to stay. Stay present. Stay honest. Stay with yourself even when the instinct is to run, because that's what most of us have been taught to do. Run from discomfort, from silence, from pain that doesn't have language. We run into people, into distractions, into plans that keep us too busy to feel. And for a while it works, until it doesn't. Until the stillness catches up to you, sits beside you on the edge of your bed and whispers, "It's time. Time to feel the grief you've been avoiding. Time to grieve the version of you that played small. Time to finally stop outsourcing your worth to people who can't even hold space for themselves." That reckoning isn't loud. It doesn't knock your world over in one sweep. It comes in waves, small at first, then stronger until you can't ignore them anymore. And when the waves rise high enough, you either learn how to swim or you start drowning in your own resistance. At first, you'll reach for all the old tools, the habits that used to dull the ache, the overworking, the people-pleasing, the constant scrolling. But they stop working. They lose their magic because you've changed. You've outgrown the bandages, and your soul starts rejecting anything that isn't real. You feel it in your bones, that hunger for truth, that need to live a life that doesn't require you to leave yourself behind. You realize that peace isn't found in pretending everything is fine. It's found in saying, "I'm not okay right now, but I'm still here." There's so much power in staying, in choosing to sit with your sadness instead of shaming it, in learning how to hold your own trembling hands when no one else is around, in finally understanding that the most sacred kind of love isn't always romantic. It's the kind you offer yourself when you don't feel lovable, when your eyes are swollen from crying, when your body aches from caring too much, when your heart feels like it's been through a war zone, and you still choose to say, "You're not broken, you're just becoming." That shift changes everything. You stop needing others to fill the void because you've started filling it yourself. Not with perfection, but with presence, with truth. You begin to show up for yourself in ways you didn't know were possible. You cook meals just for you. You write letters to your future self. You cry without muting your sobs. You take walks and talk to the sky like it's listening. You build rituals that tether you back to life, back to meaning, back to yourself. And slowly you stop feeling like a stranger in your own skin. You begin to see how the pain wasn't punishment, it was invitation. Every heartbreak, every disappointment, every rejection was showing you where you were still betraying yourself. Not as a condemnation, but as a mirror, a teacher, a way back. You learn to thank the ones who left, not because they did the right thing, but because they made space for you to come home to yourself. The absence becomes fertile ground. The quiet becomes your classroom. And you start to listen, not to the noise of the world, but to the wisdom inside you that has waited patiently all this time. You stop making excuses for your light. You stop dimming to fit into rooms that prefer you small. You begin to walk differently, speak differently, breathe differently, not out of arrogance, but out of reverence for yourself, for your journey, for the sacred ground you've walked to get here. You become intimate with your boundaries. You know the difference between being kind and being compliant, between being understanding and being used. You say no with your chest now, with your whole body, with a quiet confidence that tells people, this is sacred ground and not everyone gets to enter. And when people push back, because they will, you don't fold. You don't fight. You simply witness. You observe the ways they try to manipulate your silence, the ways they call your peace coldness, your boundaries walls, your sovereignty selfishness. But you don't engage because you know now that not every battle is worth your blood. You've bled enough for causes that were never yours. And now you're building altars instead. Altars of rest, altars of joy, altars of radical self-love. Joy begins to feel like rebellion, the kind of joy that isn't dependent on performance, the kind of joy that comes from sitting in your own company and smiling for no reason. You stop chasing the high of external validation and find comfort in the slow, steady rhythm of your own heartbeat. You laugh deeper, cry freer, love wider, not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer trying to escape your life. You're living it fully, messily, authentically. Your circle may shrink. Not everyone will understand this version of you. Some will mourn the one who bent over backward to make everyone else comfortable. Others will call you changed, distant, difficult. Let them. Their words aren't your truth. Your truth is in the way your chest feels when you say what you mean, in the way your breath softens when you're not pretending, in the way your body relaxes when you know you're safe with yourself. You start to create that safety intentionally. You declutter not just your space, but your spirit. You remove the people, the habits, the beliefs that suffocate your growth. You stop carrying guilt for outgrowing the spaces that once felt like home, because homes can become prisons. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is walk away from comfort in search of freedom. You become your own home, your own shelter, your own soft place to land. And the world feels different, not because it's changed, but because you have. You no longer see red flags and paint them white. You no longer justify bad behavior just to keep the peace. You no longer measure your worth by how much you can endure. You've learned that rest is productive, that softness is strength, that saying I don't know is wisdom. You've unlearned the hustle, the urgency, the need to prove, and in its place you've discovered something softer, still, deep. You begin to move with intention. You take fewer steps but with more purpose. You choose your words like spells, aware of their power. You stop reacting and start responding. You breathe before answering. You pause before promising. You trust your gut, not because it's always right, but because it's always yours. And that self-trust, that's the foundation for everything else. Your relationships evolve. You stop seeking saviors. You stop trying to fix people. You love them where they are, but you no longer drag them forward. You understand now that healing isn't contagious. You can't do it for anyone else. You can only be an example, a lighthouse, and those who are ready will find you. The rest will find their own way, or they won't, and that's not your burden to carry. You start measuring connection by how safe you feel, not how excited, not how needed, not how chaotic, but how safe. Do you feel seen, heard, respected? If the answer is no, you don't linger, you don't plead, you don't wait for someone to grow. You move on, with love, but with finality, because now you know what you deserve, and you're no longer afraid to choose it, even if it means being alone for a while. That solitude, it's golden. It's where you recharge, recalibrate, reconnect. You no longer see it as a punishment. It becomes your sanctuary, your sacred space, where your thoughts are allowed to roam, where your spirit can rest, where your dreams can speak freely. And in that space, you remember who you are, not who the world told you to be, who you are beneath the layers, beneath the noise. And who you are is not too much, not too sensitive, not too intense, not too broken. You are a whole world in motion, a storm in a still lake, a flame in a soft breeze. You are contradiction and harmony, chaos and calm. And that duality, it's not your flaw, it's your design. You begin to honor that design. You speak with conviction and listen with humility. You dream with your eyes wide open. You lead with your heart, but no longer let it bleed for those who refuse to stop cutting. You love without losing yourself. You rest without guilt. You grow without apology. And maybe one day someone will look at you and say, "You've changed," and you'll smile. Not because it's a compliment or a critique, but because it's true.